When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often see armored knights, chanting monks, or bustling markets. Rarely do we picture children. And yet, children were everywhere, darting through muddy village streets, chasing chickens in the yard, whispering secrets in castle corners, or laughing in the fields as bells tolled across Europe. Their world was both familiar and alien to us, filled with play, learning, and mischief, but also burdened by harsh responsibilities and the weight of survival. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not a sheltered bubble. It was a training ground for the life to come. Unlike today, when childhood is considered a unique and protected stage of life, medieval society often saw children as little adults. From the moment they could walk and talk, they were expected to contribute. For peasant children, this meant gathering wood, herding geese, or tending to siblings. For noble children, it meant learning the codes of honor, courtly manners, and the skills their family's status required. Still, they were not without joy. Children found time to play, to learn through imitation, and to carve out moments of laughter in lives that were often short and uncertain. Mortality loomed over medieval childhood. Many children never reached adulthood. Disease, famine, and war claimed countless young lives. This reality made every surviving child precious, but also hardened families. Parents loved their children, as letters and lullabies prove, but they also braced themselves for loss. This duality, tender affection mingled with practical detachment, shaped how children were raised. They were prepared early for the roles they would play, whether as farmers, artisans, monks, or noble heirs. Daily life was dictated by class. A child in a small village lived a world away from a child in a castle keep, though they shared the same rhythms of dawn and dusk. Peasant children rose with the sun to help in the fields, their hands calloused before adolescence. Noble children awoke in chambers with tapestries on the walls and servants at their side, but their days were no less demanding. A boy destined for knighthood might be sent away at 7 to serve as a page in another lord's household, beginning his long education in horsemanship, weaponry, and courtesy. A girl of noble birth might be guided in piety, music, embroidery, and estate management, her future measured in alliances and dowries. Yet across these divides, play threaded through their lives. A shepherd's son might carve a toy from wood, while a noble child might toss a leather ball in a courtyard. Games, whether with sticks or dice, were a universal language of youth. They provided moments of escape, but also mirrors of adult life. Mock battles, miniature households, and role plays of courtly rituals. In games, children rehearsed the futures awaiting them, often unconsciously. Learning, too, was inseparable from daily experience. A child on a farm learned to plow not from books, but by following his father into the furrows. A girl learned to manage a household by watching her mother measure grain, spin wool, or prepare meals. In cities, children apprenticed to masters, absorbing skills of trade through long repetition. For others, education meant letters and Latin, sometimes taught by monks or priests who saw in young boys potential clerics. Though formal schooling was rare, knowledge was passed down in songs, proverbs, and stories, shaping the minds of children who rarely held a quill. The medieval child's world was thus a balance of joy and hardship, of play and duty. They were not coddled, but neither were they entirely deprived. Their lives remind us that even in centuries defined by plague and poverty, laughter rang out in the lanes of villages, and wonder filled the eyes of children staring at stars through thatched roofs. They were tomorrow's knights, nuns, craftsmen, and mothers, carrying forward the fragile hope of a world forever on the edge of struggle. Imagine a dirt road winding through a medieval village, its edges lined with wattle and daub houses and thatched roofs. The scent of wood smoke drifts in the air, and chickens scratch at the earth. Among them dart barefoot children, their laughter carrying across the fields. Though they had little in the way of luxury, peasant children made their own happiness, crafting toys from scraps and turning the ordinary into something magical. For them, play was not only amusement, but also a vital escape from the burdens of survival. Toys were humble, fashioned by hand from whatever was available. A stick could become a sword, a horse, or even a knight's lance in the imagination of a child. Dolls were stitched from scraps of cloth, stuffed with straw or carved from wood, their faces sometimes no more than 2 dots and a line. These crude figures became companions, teaching little girls the rhythms of care and nurture that adulthood would demand of them. A bundle of rags wrapped in a shawl could be a baby. A carved spoon might double as a puppet. The artistry of these toys lay not in their detail, but in the boundless imagination they inspired. Balls were among the most popular amusements. Some were made of leather, stuffed with rags or animal hair, while poorer children used pig bladders inflated with air. Games of kicking, throwing, and chasing such balls filled village greens, echoing with shouts and cheers. These early ball games foreshadowed later sports, though in the medieval age they were far rougher, often spilling into chaotic scrambles that left children muddy and bruised. Still, the thrill of the chase bonded them, teaching cooperation and rivalry in equal measure. Hobby horses were another delight. A child might straddle a stick with a carved or painted head and gallop through the village like a knight charging into battle. Boys in particular reveled in these games, echoing the martial culture that surrounded them. With shrill war cries and wooden swords, they imitated the clashes they heard whispered about by adults. These games, half play and half rehearsal, prepared them for the reality of conscription or service in lordly armies that lay ahead. Music and rhythm found their place in children's play as well. Wooden flutes, whistles, or simple drums made from stretched skins gave joy to gatherings. Children clapped, sang, and danced in circles, often echoing the songs of their parents. These games of sound and movement carried echoes of folk tradition, weaving young voices into the cultural fabric of their community. In the spinning of a dance or the cadence of a rhyme, children learned language, memory, and fellowship. Nature itself was a playground. Fields became arenas for races, rivers offered skipping stones, and forests brimmed with sticks, nuts, and berries that could be turned into toys or tools. In an age without manufactured entertainment, the world around them served as stage, workshop, and treasure chest. Even chores sometimes blurred into games. Herding geese could become a competition, gathering firewood a race, weaving wildflowers a contest of beauty. The line between duty and play was porous, making joy possible even in the midst of responsibility. Of course, toys and play were not entirely innocent. Dice and knucklebones, played even by children, introduced them early to games of chance. Parents often warned against the dangers of gambling, yet the thrill of tossing bones onto dirt floors was irresistible. These games taught risk and reward, echoing the uncertainties of medieval life itself. Though simple by modern standards, the toys and games of peasant children carried immense value. They provided relief from long hours of labor and gave children a chance to be something beyond little adults. Through play, they rehearsed the roles of warriors, mothers, farmers, and artisans, all while forging bonds of friendship and community. Their laughter was proof that even in poverty, joy could be carved from wood, stitched from rags, or blown into a pig's bladder. Medieval children, whether in bustling towns or quiet villages, loved games that tested their skill and daring. These were not merely diversions, they were rehearsals for the lives awaiting them, in a world where survival required strength, wit, and luck. The games of childhood often mirrored the challenges of adulthood. They honed the body, sharpened the mind, and offered lessons in competition, cooperation, and fate. One of the most enduring amusements was knucklebones, a game older than Rome itself. Children used the small bones of sheep or goats, tossing them in the air and catching them in nimble hands. Sometimes the bones were carved or painted, turning them into tokens of fortune. Success required dexterity and practice, but also chance, an early lesson in how skill and luck intertwined. Dice games, too, found their way into children's play, though dice were often frowned upon by churchmen who warned against gambling. Still, the clatter of cubes on wooden tables echoed in cottages and taverns alike, teaching children that risk could be thrilling, and that fortune was fickle. Marbles, or their medieval equivalents, were played with polished stones or small balls of clay. Children knelt in the dirt, flicking their marbles toward a target, the game requiring precision and patience. Winners claimed the marbles of the losers, adding stakes to the contest. In these simple rounds, children learned both the satisfaction of victory and the sting of loss, lessons that would accompany them into the wider struggles of adulthood. Physical contests abounded. Wrestling was a favorite pastime, as natural in the field as in the training ground. Boys grappled in the mud, testing strength and endurance, cheered on by their peers. These games echoed the martial spirit of the age, where war was ever present and physical prowess meant survival. Races across fields, climbing trees, and contests of stone throwing provided outlets for restless energy, while building bodies hardened for toil or combat. Ball games, rough and chaotic, often blurred the line between sport and brawl. A leather ball or even a pig's bladder became the center of frenzied scrambles. There were few rules, and the game might sweep across entire villages, with children charging through mud and over fences in pursuit of the prize. These wild contests foreshadowed later sports like football, but were far more brutal, teaching teamwork and toughness in the same breath. Girls, too, played games that tested skill. Spinning tops carved from wood, hoop rolling with sticks, or balancing contests all demanded agility and balance. Singing games and clapping rhythms combined music with movement, teaching coordination while binding young girls together in circles of laughter. Such games prepared them for the tasks of weaving, spinning, and managing households, yet they also gave them freedom to revel in joy apart from duty. Strategic play appeared in board games. The medieval variant of chess, brought from the East, became popular among noble families, where children learned tactics, patience, and foresight. Even simpler games like Nine Men's Morris could be scratched into a wooden board or the dirt, offering practice in planning moves and anticipating an opponent. In these contests, children absorbed the seeds of strategy that would serve knights on the battlefield or merchants in their dealings. These games, though playful, carried hidden weight. Dice and knucklebones whispered of fortune's whims, ball games forged cooperation in chaos, and wrestling molded strength. Childhood in the Middle Ages wasn't separated from adulthood by walls of protection. It was a gradual training ground where games prepared the young for life's trials. And through every contest, laughter echoed, proof that even in a harsh world, joy was never far from hand. In the echoing stone chambers of a castle, childhood looked very different from the muddy fields of peasants. Noble children were heirs to estates, titles, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond their tender years. Their education was not simply about reading or writing. It was a carefully designed path to mold future rulers, warriors, and ladies of influence. From the moment of birth, noble sons and daughters were bound to expectations as rigid as the stone walls surrounding them. Boys, especially eldest sons, were the focus of intense preparation. Their earliest years were spent under the watch of nurses and governesses who tended to their health and manners. At the age of 7, a turning point arrived. The boy was often sent away from his family to serve as a page in the household of another noble lord. This was no punishment, but an honor and a crucial stage of education. As a page, he learned courtesy, humility, and obedience, carrying messages, serving meals, and standing at the elbows of knights. Yet these duties were paired with lessons in reading, writing, and sometimes Latin, taught by chaplains or clerics attached to the household. Alongside his studies, physical training was paramount. Pages practiced riding horses, handling hunting dogs, and learning the basics of swordplay with wooden weapons. They played at jousts in miniature, galloping with hobby horses and tilting at targets. Each game carried the weight of future warfare, preparing them for the day when mock battles would give way to real ones. A noble boy's body was hardened through hunting, running, and wrestling, his mind sharpened by tales of chivalry and honor. By the age of 14, many pages became squires, stepping closer to the life of knighthood. As squires, they trained in earnest with real weapons, served knights in battle, and absorbed the brutal realities of combat. Yet even here, education continued, learning heraldry, managing estates, and understanding the codes of fealty and loyalty that bound the medieval world. A squire's education was not just about strength, but about knowing one's place in the fragile chain of feudal society. Noble girls followed a different path, though no less demanding. From an early age, they were taught the virtues of piety, obedience, and domestic skill. Under the guidance of governesses, they learned to embroider, weave, and manage the affairs of a household. Music and song were also encouraged, for noble daughters were expected to provide grace and refinement within the halls of power. Yet their education was more than ornamental. Many noble women were tasked with overseeing estates, while their husbands fought in wars. Thus, girls learned arithmetic, estate management, and even elements of diplomacy, skills hidden beneath the veil of modesty. Literacy was valued, though not universal. Some noble daughters were taught to read and write, particularly in convent schools where education mingled with devotion. For others, education came in the form of oral tradition, listening to troubadours sing of love, saints, and heroes. These stories shaped their understanding of duty, sacrifice, and destiny. Through both song and scripture, noble children were immersed in a world view where divine order and earthly hierarchy were inseparable. What united noble boys and girls was the emphasis on shaping character. Chivalry was drilled into sons, while piety and virtue were instilled in daughters. Every lesson, every story, every duty reinforced the expectation that they were not ordinary children, but guardians of lineage and reputation. Their lives were rehearsals for adulthood, for in noble society, childhood was a brief and purposeful season, meant to prepare the young for roles upon which entire families, and sometimes entire kingdoms, depended. And yet, even here, in castle halls, there was laughter. Noble children still played with balls and dolls, still carved out moments of innocent joy in gardens and courtyards. But their games always carried shadows of the future, for play was never just play. It was practice for the lives carved out by their birth. If the village was a place of mud and play, and the castle a place of duty and privilege, then the monastery was a world apart, ordered by bells, silence, and scripture. For many children, particularly boys offered by their families to the church, Monastic life was not a choice, but a calling imposed upon them. Yet within those stone walls lay one of the few structured systems of education available in the Middle Ages, where literacy, devotion, and discipline were forged together. Children sent to monasteries were often very young, sometimes as early as 7 years old. They entered as oblates, literally offerings to God, dedicated by their parents in hope of salvation for the family, or as a means of giving sons a stable life in a world of uncertainty. These boys, clad in simple robes, quickly learned that their days would be governed not by whim, but by the toll of the cloister's bell. Their first lessons were in prayer. They memorized psalms, chanted hymns, and followed the daily rhythm of the divine office. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, vespers at dusk. In doing so, they internalized not only Latin words, but the idea that time itself belonged to God. This constant cycle of prayer was their first education in discipline, teaching them that every hour carried spiritual weight. Reading and writing soon followed, taught in the echoing halls of the scriptorium or in small chambers lit by flickering candles. The alphabet was traced on wax tablets, letters recited aloud in the sing-song of novices. Latin, the language of the Church, was the cornerstone of their learning. Boys copied passages of Scripture, each stroke of the quill a lesson in patience and devotion. Mistakes were corrected with stern reminders that errors in God's Word were no small matter. But monastic education was not limited to Scripture. Many monasteries taught the basics of arithmetic, music, and even rudimentary natural philosophy. Chant required an understanding of musical notation, and managing monastery lands required accounting. Thus, children within monasteries often became more literate and skilled than their peers outside. They were being prepared not only as monks, but also as future clerics, scribes, and administrators who would serve kings, bishops, and lords. Life, however, was not easy. Discipline was strict, and punishments could be harsh. A boy who faltered in his duties might be subjected to fasting, silence, or even physical correction. Yet alongside this severity came a sense of purpose. To belong to a monastery was to be part of something eternal, a chain of devotion stretching back to the apostles. Many children grew to embrace this calling, their youthful play replaced by the solemn joy of service. Still, childhood found its way into cloistered walls. Even within monasteries, children played games during brief respites, tossing pebbles, racing in courtyards, or whispering stories when they should have been silent. Some of these games were infused with moral lessons, while others were simply escapes from the weight of prayer and study. In this, they revealed a truth. Even in holy houses, the laughter of youth could not be extinguished. Monastic education left a lasting mark on medieval society. From these schools emerged generations of literate men who copied manuscripts, preserved ancient texts, and advised rulers. Many of the stories, records, and chronicles we have today exist because children once sat in cold chambers, scratching ink onto parchment. The monastery, while austere, was a cradle of learning, one of the few lights of knowledge in an age often defined by darkness. For the child within those walls, life was narrow but profound. They grew up with fewer games than peasants, fewer privileges than nobles, but with a rare gift: access to learning that would shape not only their futures, but the memory of an entire civilization. In the humming heart of medieval towns, beneath the shadows of cathedral spires and market stalls, the sound of hammers, chisels, and looms filled the air. Here, childhood was often cut short by necessity, for children of artisans and merchants were apprenticed at an early age to learn the crafts that would sustain them for life. Apprenticeships were not just schooling. They were contracts of destiny, binding young hands to skills that shaped both family honor and community survival. Apprenticeship usually began around the age of 12, though some children entered earlier. Parents negotiated with a master craftsman, whether a blacksmith, carpenter, weaver, or shoemaker, agreeing that their son, and more rarely, daughter, would serve under his roof for a set number of years, often 7. During that time, the apprentice worked in exchange for food, lodging, and training. Wages were rare. Instead, the true reward was mastery of a trade and eventual entry into the guild. Life as an apprentice was harsh. From dawn until dusk, the child labored in the workshop, fetching tools, stoking fires, carrying heavy loads, and performing endless repetitions of basic tasks. A blacksmith's apprentice, for example, might spend months striking iron under a master's direction, learning the rhythm of hammer and anvil. A weaver's apprentice might wind yarn until fingers ached before ever touching the loom. Patience, endurance, and obedience were drilled into them as surely as skill. Yet apprenticeship was also a path of opportunity. To complete training and become a journeyman meant stepping into the world as an independent worker, with the chance of one day becoming a master and joining the guild. Guilds were powerful institutions, protecting trade secrets, setting prices, and ensuring quality. For many children of modest means, apprenticeship was the key to respectability, stability, and a future beyond the back-breaking toil of the fields. Girls, though fewer in number, also took part in apprenticeships, especially in urban settings. Many learned trades like brewing, textile production, or midwifery. Others became assistants in households of merchants, where they acquired skills in bookkeeping, negotiation, and estate management. Though barred from many guilds, women's labor was essential, and daughters often inherited the knowledge of their mother's crafts. In some towns, widows even took over their husbands' workshops, passing down skills to their children. The apprenticeship system was as much about moral instruction as craft. Masters were expected to discipline apprentices, shaping their character as well as their hands. Rules often forbade gambling, drinking, or idleness, and punishments could be severe. Yet bonds often grew between master and apprentice, resembling that of father and son. A master's household became the apprentice's world, a surrogate family in which loyalty and respect were demanded, and, at times, genuinely given. Despite the rigors, apprentices found ways to keep their youth alive. In stolen moments, they played dice in alleyways, chased one another through cobbled streets, or joined festive games during holy days. Town charters reveal complaints of apprentices causing mischief, suggesting that laughter and rebellion thrived even in the strictest workshops. For all their discipline, apprentices remained children, straddling the line between duty and play. By the end of their term, many apprentices emerged as skilled workers, ready to craft shoes, weave cloth, forge tools, or carve wood. They carried the pride of belonging to a tradition that stretched across generations, where knowledge was not written in books but hammered into arms and woven into calloused fingers. Apprenticeships created not only artisans, but also a sense of community, linking child and master, family and guild into the living fabric of medieval towns. For children of this world, play was brief, but purpose was everything. Through long days of labor, they were molded into the hands that built cathedrals, forged swords, and spun the very cloth that clothed an age. Their childhood was apprenticeship, and their apprenticeship was the foundation of a life. For peasant children, life was not shaped by parchment, quills, or guild contracts, but by earth, seasons, and survival. Unlike noble heirs or town apprentices, few peasant boys or girls saw the inside of a schoolroom. Their education came not from books, but from the hands and voices of parents, neighbors, and the land itself. It was a world where necessity, not scholarship, dictated what a child must know. From the moment they could walk, peasant children became helpers. A toddler might shoo chickens from the doorway, while an older child carried water from a stream or gathered sticks for firewood. By 7 or 8, many children were expected to herd geese or pigs, tasks that kept them outdoors for long hours, but also granted them a measure of independence. These early duties taught responsibility in ways no classroom could replicate. A mistake meant lost food, lost warmth, or even danger from wild animals. Farming itself was the great teacher. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, learning to plow, sow, and harvest by watching and imitating. They learned the smell of rain on soil, the signs of pests in crops, and the endless patience required to coax life from the earth. Girls shadowed their mothers, absorbing the rhythm of spinning wool, baking bread, brewing ale, and tending gardens. Their curriculum was the household itself, every chore a lesson in survival and continuity. Oral tradition played a central role. Stories, proverbs, and songs passed down wisdom that no book recorded. Around hearth fires, children heard cautionary tales of saints, sinners, and spirits, each carrying moral lessons or practical warnings. Rhymes taught them the seasons of planting, riddles sharpened their wit, and fables illustrated virtues like honesty, diligence, and courage. In this way, culture and memory became their schoolmasters. Religious instruction, too, shaped peasant learning. Priests taught children their prayers, the catechism, and the rituals of the church. While few peasants could read Latin, they knew the rhythms of the Mass, the meanings of holy days, and the fear of sin. Parish churches sometimes offered rudimentary schooling, especially in larger villages where boys might learn basic letters or numbers. Yet for most, literacy remained a dream out of reach. Their knowledge was spiritual, practical, and oral, not academic. The seasons themselves were an unspoken teacher. Winter meant storing food, mending clothes, and enduring hardship. Spring taught renewal, planting, and hope. Summer demanded endless labor in the fields, while autumn brought harvest and feasting. Each cycle of the year imprinted itself on children's minds, shaping their sense of time and life. Unlike the clock-driven schedules of modern schools, peasant children grew up guided by sun, moon, and weather. Despite these hardships, there was joy. Work and play often mingled. Herding geese could turn into races, berry picking into competitions, or weaving wildflowers into crowns. Through games, children rehearsed adult roles, pretending to bake bread or wield tools, echoing the tasks they watched their parents perform. Even in poverty, laughter threaded through their days, proving that childhood could not be extinguished by labor alone. In truth, peasant education was both limited and profound. These children rarely mastered letters or numbers, but they learned resilience, endurance, and skill. They might not read chronicles of kings, but they knew the language of soil and sky. Their survival was their diploma, their family's well-being their final exam. Though history often overlooks them, it was these children, educated by earth and toil, who carried medieval society on their small, sturdy shoulders. In the fields beyond the village, or within the courtyards of castles, children's laughter often disguised a deeper truth. Their games were rehearsals for the future. In a society shaped by war, labor, and survival, play was rarely idle. It prepared young bodies and minds for the roles they would soon assume, whether as warriors, mothers, or craftsmen. Childhood in the Middle Ages was brief, and the line between play and duty was thin. For boys, war was never far from imagination. Armed with wooden swords, sticks, or even carved reeds, they staged mock battles in the dust. Teams were formed, castles were improvised from haystacks, and cries of "charge" echoed like miniature crusades. These games were more than make-believe. They trained muscles, reflexes, and courage. Wrestling matches tested strength, while archery with small bows honed precision. Even stone-throwing contests, common among village boys, mimicked the skills of siege warfare. In their rough play, boys were preparing for the day when wooden swords would become iron, and games would be replaced by blood. Girls, too, practiced futures through play, though their duties lay in different realms. They cradled rag dolls as if they were infants, learning tenderness and responsibility. They mimicked their mother's chores, pretending to bake, weave, or mend, transforming daily labor into make-believe. But these imitations were not frivolous. They ingrained habits and expectations that would define their adult lives. By the time a girl reached adolescence, she had already rehearsed her role as mother and mistress of a household through countless hours of play. In noble courts, play took on a more formal edge. Young pages practiced jousting with blunt lances, riding hobby horses at wooden targets, or fencing under watchful eyes. Girls embroidered side by side, turning craft into competition, or performed songs and dances meant to display grace. Even leisure among the nobility was training in disguise, preparing children to embody chivalry, refinement, and dignity. The church also used play as moral preparation. Religious dramas and mystery plays often included children in small roles, teaching them biblical stories through performance. Some festivals allowed children to take part in symbolic games that reinforced moral lessons, triumphs of saints over demons, or symbolic chases representing good defeating evil. Play, in these settings, was a mirror of cosmic battles, embedding faith into youthful hearts. Not all play was so structured. Rougher games like Prisoner's Base or King of the Hill carried their own lessons. Children learned loyalty, strategy, and the thrill of competition. They discovered what it meant to win honor among peers, or to endure the sting of defeat. In these contests, laughter masked the forging of resilience and discipline. Play also bridged the gulf between genders and classes. During festivals, children from different families mingled freely, joining dances, chasing hoops, or competing in games of chance. Though their adult lives would be rigidly divided, in childhood they found brief equality through shared laughter. These moments of freedom were rare but precious, reminding us that beneath the weight of duty, children sought joy together. Ultimately, play was a paradox, both innocent and serious, both joy and preparation. For medieval children, the games of youth were stepping stones into adult identity. A boy pretending to slay a dragon was rehearsing for knighthood. A girl cradling a doll was rehearsing for motherhood. Even as they laughed, they were being shaped by expectations as old as their world. Childhood games, far from trivial, were the silent tutors of a society where adulthood came too soon, and every lesson carried the weight of survival. When the day's labor was finished and shadows stretched long across the fields, the medieval child entered a classroom without walls. Lessons of right and wrong, good and evil, were taught not through parchment and ink, but through voice and melody. Stories and songs, passed from generation to generation, were the moral compass of childhood, shaping young minds in ways both subtle and profound. Around the hearth fire, children gathered to hear tales from parents or grandparents. These were not idle fancies, but woven threads of wisdom. Fables told of animals who could speak, sly foxes and faithful hounds, each embodying virtues and vices familiar to everyday life. From these stories, children learned caution, cleverness, loyalty, and humility. A simple tale about a farmer and his ox might remind them that diligence and kindness to animals were rewarded, while cruelty brought ruin. Religious stories were everywhere. Priests and elders recounted the lives of saints, miraculous deeds, and punishments for sin. A story of Saint Nicholas saving children from famine or Saint George slaying the dragon instilled courage, faith, and reverence. These legends blurred the line between entertainment and catechism, leaving children with unforgettable images of holiness and heroism. To a medieval child, saints were not distant figures, but guardians who might intervene in daily struggles. Songs carried equal weight. Work songs helped rhythm guide tasks, but they also carried lessons. Nursery rhymes, though simple, often hid warnings about nature, sickness, or social order. Children's chants during games taught cooperation and timing while embedding cultural memory. In villages, wandering minstrels sang of knights, quests, and betrayals, filling young ears with tales of honor and caution against pride. Morality was often taught through fear as well as inspiration. Ghost stories and cautionary tales warned children of the dangers of disobedience. A child who strayed too far into the woods might meet a spirit or demon. A greedy soul might be punished in the afterlife. These stories, whispered in the dark, reinforced obedience to parents, respect for the church, and wariness of temptation. Even riddles and proverbs shaped thought. A riddle about a plow or a riddle about the moon sharpened wit, but it also taught children to observe the world carefully. Proverbs, short and sharp, became guiding principles. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, or patience reaps reward. These sayings lived on children's tongues long after their first hearing, becoming silent teachers in daily choices. In noble courts, entertainment had similar roles but greater refinement. Children heard chansons de geste, epic poems of Roland or Charlemagne, where loyalty and sacrifice stood above life itself. Minstrels' songs celebrated valor while warning of treachery. For noble boys, these stories set ideals of knighthood. For girls, they illustrated the virtues of chastity, piety, and loyalty. Play and imagination were steeped in these ideals, binding their identities to cultural expectations. Through stories and songs, children learned not only morality, but also belonging. Each tale reminded them they were part of something larger, their family, their village, Christendom itself. In the laughter after a clever riddle, in the solemn hush after a tale of saintly sacrifice, in the haunting refrain of a ballad sung by a wandering bard, children felt the invisible thread that tied them to their ancestors, their community, and their God. So it was that childhood in the Middle Ages was guided by voices. No ink was needed, no formal teacher required. Words themselves, sung, spoken, whispered, were the chalk on the slate of young hearts. And in those voices, the lessons of faith, duty, and resilience lived on, carried forward into the next generation. When we look back at the children of the Middle Ages, we see lives that were at once harder and yet, in some ways, richer than our own. Their world was one of labor and danger, of narrow expectations and early responsibilities. And yet, in their games, songs, and lessons, we find echoes of our modern selves, threads of laughter, imagination, and learning that span the centuries. The legacy of medieval childhood lies not in what was written in books, but in the rhythms of life they carried with them. The noble child and the peasant child walked very different paths, yet both were shaped by a society that valued hierarchy and survival. For the son of a knight, wooden lances became steel. For the peasant boy, stick swords were set aside for scythes. The lessons of play were never wasted. They prepared each child for the role their station demanded. We, who now see childhood as a protected time of innocence, must remember that for them, childhood was a brief apprenticeship for adulthood. Still, joy found its way even into lives filled with duty. The rag doll cradled by a peasant girl, the marble flicked across a dirt floor, the chant of a rhyme sung in play. All these moments speak to a resilience of spirit. Despite hardships, laughter echoed in the lanes of villages and the courtyards of castles. This joy, fleeting yet eternal, is part of their gift to history, proof that humanity always seeks delight, even under heavy burdens. The moral lessons of stories and songs echo even today. Medieval children learned to fear wolves in the woods, to admire saints who conquered sin, and to respect the bonds of family and faith. Many of these tales evolved into fairy stories, still told in nurseries and classrooms. What once served as survival lessons, warnings about wandering too far or succumbing to greed, became the foundations of timeless folklore, carrying medieval wisdom into the modern age. The medieval child's education, whether through prayer, apprenticeship, or parental instruction, also reminds us that learning does not require schools or books alone. A field, a hearth, or a workbench could be as powerful as any classroom. They show us that education is not confined to walls, but lives in experience, observation, and tradition. That truth still resonates, even as we rely on formal schooling today. If anything, the greatest legacy of medieval childhood is perspective. By studying how children lived, played, and learned, we see the endurance of the human spirit. We see how values, imagination, and laughter can survive even in an age shadowed by disease, war, and poverty. We see ourselves reflected in their games and their songs, in the tenderness with which they held their dolls, and in the thrill of their make-believe battles. Modern childhood, with its toys, schools, and protections, stands on foundations laid centuries ago. The desire to play, to learn, to imagine futures greater than the present was as alive in a medieval child as it is in a child today. The difference lies in how soon they had to surrender their innocence. That truth should inspire us to value the longer childhoods our own children enjoy, to treasure what was once so rare. In the end, the legacy of medieval childhood is a story of continuity and change. The children of the Middle Ages remind us that play is never wasted, that learning comes in many forms, and that laughter can echo even in the harshest times. Their voices may be long silenced, but through their games, their songs, and the lessons they carried into adulthood, they still whisper across the centuries, reminding us of the timeless resilience of youth.